"Your wife left something inside that wall," the demolition worker said. "Sir, please, don't come alone." I was standing in the parking lot of St. Michael's when my phone rang. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, cold enough that my breath showed in the air, and I had just come from lighting a candle for Miriam. 1 year. That's how long she had been gone. And I had finally decided to do something with her old workshop. The man who called was the crew foreman, a heavy-set guy named Pete who I'd hired through a local contractor 3 weeks prior. His voice was off. Not panicked, but careful. The way someone sounds when they're trying not to alarm you and failing at it. "What do you mean she left something?" I asked. "There's a room, Mr. Calloway, behind the east wall of the storage bay. We broke through for the new wiring and, sir, I think you need to see this yourself. And maybe bring your sons. Whatever's in here, it looks like it was meant for all of you." I stood there for a moment with the phone against my ear, the candle still warm in my memory. Miriam had never mentioned any room. "My name is Lawrence Calloway. I'm 68 years old. I spent 31 years building a small manufacturing business in Dayton, Ohio. Nothing glamorous, just precision metal parts for agricultural equipment." Miriam ran the books. She had a head for numbers that I never had, and a patience for paperwork that I respected deeply. We had 2 sons together, my older boy Mitchell, who was 43 and worked in commercial real estate in Columbus, and my younger son Preston, who was 39 and had spent the last decade bouncing between sales jobs and excuses. When Miriam was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in March of the previous year, she declined fast. Faster than any of us were ready for. She was gone by October, and by November, Mitchell and Preston had already begun talking about settling the estate in ways that made me feel like furniture to be appraised. Mitchell was the organized one. He showed up to Miriam's memorial with a yellow legal pad and a pen behind his ear. Preston mostly showed up with opinions about what things were worth. I had sold the manufacturing business 2 years before Miriam got sick. A clean sale, good terms, and I had put most of the proceeds into a mix of indexed funds, a rental property in Springfield, and a savings account that I honestly hadn't touched. Miriam managed all of it. That was her domain, and I trusted her without question for 38 years. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that Miriam had kept the old workshop. When we sold the business, the buyer took the equipment and the client list, but the building itself was on a separate parcel that Miriam had quietly retained in her own name. She told me she was handling the property paperwork. I assumed it had been sold too. It had not been sold. I only found out when the property tax notice showed up addressed to her estate 6 months after she passed. The building was a squat, unremarkable structure on the east side of Dayton, about 4,000 square feet concrete block, built in the 1970s. I had contacted a demolition and renovation crew to assess what it would cost to either gut and lease it or tear it down entirely. Pete's crew had started work 2 weeks ago. I hadn't visited the site since the initial walkthrough. Now Pete was telling me there was a room inside the wall. I drove over alone. I know what you're thinking. Pete said to bring my sons. I didn't. Not right away. The truth is, by that point in my life, I had learned to be careful about what I showed Mitchell and Preston before I understood it myself. They had a habit, both of them, but Mitchell especially, of arriving at conclusions before they had any facts and then working backwards to justify those conclusions. It was a trait I recognized from somewhere in myself, the worst version of myself, and I had never figured out how to address it in them without starting a fight. So I drove to the workshop alone on that Tuesday morning, and I asked Pete to show me what they'd found. The east wall of the storage bay had been partially opened for electrical conduit work. The crew had pulled back the drywall, added sometime in the 90s, Pete explained, over the original cinder block, and found a hollow space behind it. Not an accident of construction, a deliberate cavity, about 8 feet wide and 6 feet deep, framed with 2x4s and insulated. A real room. Small, but intentional. Inside were 3 things. A fireproof document safe, the kind you could buy at any office supply store, bolted to a wooden shelf that had been built into the back wall. A plastic storage bin, the large kind, with a snap-on lid, full of what looked like hanging files, and a white envelope taped to the inside of the framing, with my name on it. Not Lawrence, not the estate, Just Lori, the name she had called me for 38 years and that no one else on earth used anymore. I stood in that small dusty space with Pete's flashlight and I did not open anything for a long moment. I just looked. She had known. Somehow, in whatever quiet calculation she had been running in the last months of her life, she had known that something needed to be preserved outside of the normal channels. Outside of the will, the estate attorney, the processes that Mitchell had already inserted himself into. I took the envelope, I asked Pete to padlock the storage bay and not to let anyone else in without my direct authorization, and I told him I'd be back the following morning. I did not take the safe or the bin, not yet. I drove to my attorney's office instead. Her name is Barbara Finch. She's been my attorney for 22 years, and she is one of the most practical human beings I have ever encountered. I called ahead from the car, and she cleared her noon appointment. I sat across from Barbara at her desk, and I opened the envelope for Miriam. It was 3 pages, handwritten, dated 8 months before she died. Miriam wrote the way she spoke, plainly, efficiently, with no wasted words. She began by telling me she loved me. She said that wasn't the point of the letter, but she wanted to say it first because everything else was business, and she didn't want the business to be the last thing I heard from her. Then she got to the business. She had discovered, approximately 14 months before her diagnosis, that Mitchell had been using the manufacturing company's accounts receivable as informal collateral for personal loans. Not through any official channel. He had relationships with 2 of our longtime clients, men he'd cultivated over years of holiday dinners and golf weekends, and he had persuaded them to advance him payments on future orders, payments that technically flowed through the company, but that Mitchell redirected before Miriam could post them to the ledger. She had caught it during a quarterly reconciliation and confronted him privately. Mitchell had cried. He said he was in trouble. Gambling debts, she wrote, and then underlined it, the way she did when something mattered. He had a sports betting problem that had grown far beyond what he could manage, and he had borrowed against the company to cover it without telling anyone, including his wife. Miriam had made him stop. She had made him sign a private repayment agreement, kept the original, and told him she would handle it. She did not tell me. She told me later in the letter, in that careful handwriting, that she had not told me because she knew I would have confronted Mitchell immediately, and she didn't think confrontation was what the situation needed. She thought she could fix it quietly and protect both of us. She had not been wrong exactly. But then she got sick, and with her sick, and then gone. The repayment agreement was sitting in a document safe in a hidden room, and Mitchell was free to rewrite whatever history suited him. There was more. The plastic bin, she wrote, contained 5 years of financial records she had kept separately from the company's official books. Not because anything was hidden from the IRS, she was careful to say, but because she had begun keeping a parallel set of records when she first suspected Mitchell's diversion. Those records documented everything. The diverted payments, the informal loans, the repayment agreement, correspondence she had printed and saved, bank statements she had annotated by hand. She had also, in the last months of her life, transferred the workshop property into a trust in which I was the sole beneficiary and which could not be altered or contested without her notarized signature, which was no longer available to anyone. The property was worth approximately $400,000 by her estimate, possibly more. It was not part of the estate that Mitchell had been eagerly organizing. It was separate. It was protected. And it was mine. Barbara read the letter twice without speaking. Then she set it down on her desk and looked at me. "Lawrence," she said, "we need to go get that safe." We went the next morning. Barbara, her paralegal, and a locksmith she trusted. I did not call my sons. The safe contained exactly what Miriam's letter said it would. The repayment agreement, bank records, a USB drive with scanned copies of everything, organized in folders labeled by date and category in that precise way she had. There was also a sealed letter addressed to Mitchell, which Barbara took custody of immediately. I sat in my truck in the parking lot of the old workshop for a long time after they loaded everything into Barbara's car. The October sky was flat and gray, the color of old pavement. A few dead leaves skittered across the lot. I thought about the last year, about how Mitchell had installed himself as the primary contact for the estate attorney within weeks of Miriam dying, about how he had suggested 3 months in that it might be simpler for me to sign a general power of attorney and let him manage the administrative side of things, given everything I was going through. About how Preston had backed him up on this. Not because Preston understood the details, but because Preston rarely understood the details and rarely needed to, as long as the outcome included something for Preston. I had not signed the power of attorney. I hadn't known why at the time. It had just felt wrong in some way I couldn't name. Some quiet alarm that Miriam herself might have installed in me over 38 years of paying attention to her judgment. I was glad I had listened. What followed was not a dramatic confrontation. That's probably the part that surprises people when I tell this story. There were no shouting matches. No one threw anything. It was, from the outside, entirely unremarkable. Barbara sent a certified letter to Mitchell's attorney. Yes, he had his own attorney, outlining the documentation we had recovered and requesting a meeting. Mitchell called me himself that same evening, and I let the call go to voicemail. He left a message that lasted 4 minutes and 40 seconds, most of which was him explaining, in a calm and reasonable voice, how there must be some misunderstanding. Preston called 10 minutes later, which told me that Mitchell had called Preston first and that they had already had a conversation about how to handle me. I didn't call either of them back that night. The meeting happened the following week, in Barbara's conference room. Mitchell came with his attorney. Preston came with Mitchell. I came with Barbara and the paralegal. We sat across a long table from each other, and I noticed for the first time how tired Mitchell looked. Not the fatigue of hard work. Something older, the kind of tired that comes from keeping a story straight for a long time. Barbara walked through the documentation methodically. The diverted payments, just under $60,000 over 18 months. The repayment agreement, signed by Mitchell in Miriam's presence, which he had honored partially before her death and not at all after. The property trust. The parallel records. All of it. Mitchell's attorney asked several questions. Mitchell himself said very little. At one point, he looked at me across the table, and I looked back at him, and I didn't say anything because I didn't know what there was to say that would matter. Preston, to his credit, said nothing at all. He sat with his hands flat on the table like a man, waiting for a verdict he already knew. The outcome was negotiated, not litigated, because that was what Miriam would have wanted, and I knew it. Mitchell agreed to full repayment of the diverted funds, with interest, on a structured schedule that his attorney and Barbara hammered out over the following 10 days. The repayment terms were attached to the property trust as a condition, meaning that if he defaulted, the trust would automatically pursue legal recovery. He had no good options, and he knew it. He also agreed, as part of the settlement, to step back from any administrative role in the estate and to let Barbara's firm manage the process going forward. The rental property in Springfield, which Mitchell had already begun inquiring about with the estate attorney, I later learned remained mine. The index funds, which had grown quietly over the previous 2 years to just under $480,000, remained mine. The workshop property, once renovated, was leased to a small manufacturing outfit for $2,200 a month, which covered my property taxes, my utilities, and my monthly lunches with Barbara, with enough left to put a little away. Preston came to see me alone about 3 weeks after the meeting. He sat at my kitchen table and drank coffee and didn't say much for a long time. Then he said that he had known something was off for years and he hadn't said anything, and he was sorry for that. I told him I appreciated him saying so. I didn't tell him that I already knew he'd known. Miriam's letter had mentioned it in one quiet line near the end. Preston is aware that something is wrong, but he won't look at it directly. He never has. That's its own kind of problem, Lori, but it's a different kind than Mitchell's. She was right about that too. The hardest part of that year wasn't the paperwork or the meetings or even the discovery of what Mitchell had done. The hardest part was something quieter. It was realizing that Miriam had carried all of this alone for 14 months. That she had sat across from me at breakfast every morning knowing what she knew. And she had made the calculation that protecting me from it in the short term was worth the weight of carrying it herself. She had filed it away, documented it, hidden it behind a wall, and trusted that I would find it when I needed to. She had trusted me to listen to a quiet alarm. She had trusted that I would not sign the power of attorney. She had trusted me to find Pete's number in the phone book and hire someone to figure out what to do with that building. Because she knew I would eventually get around to it. Because she knew me. I think about that more than anything else. Not what my sons did. Not the money. Just that she knew me well enough to build a trapdoor for me and to trust that I'd find it. There's a woman at my church named Dolores. She's 71, widowed about 5 years before Miriam passed, and she has more good sense than most people I've met in 6 decades. We started having coffee after the Tuesday morning service sometime in the spring after all of this resolved. Just coffee. Just conversation. She asked me once how I was managing. I told her I was doing better than I expected. I told her that my younger son came over for Sunday dinners most weeks, and that we were working through things slowly, which was probably the right pace for him. I told her that Mitchell and I had not spoken socially since the conference room, but that I had sent him a card when my granddaughter, his daughter, turned 7, and that he had texted me a photo of her in her birthday dress, which I took as a beginning. Dolores nodded at that. She said it sounded like I had a map. I thought about Miriam then, her careful handwriting, her annotated bank statements, her 3 pages of plain, honest words. Yeah, I told Dolores. Somebody left me one. I've had a lot of time to sit with everything that happened. Not just the legal side of it, the meetings, the documents, the structured repayment schedule that Barbara and Mitchell's attorney spent 10 days negotiating. That part resolved itself the way most practical things do, one step at a time, until it was done. What I keep coming back to is something harder to name. Mitchell made choices. He made them quietly, over 18 months, in small increments that probably felt manageable to him each time. I don't think he woke up one morning and decided to become someone who steals from his own family. I think he got in over his head, panicked, and reached for the nearest thing that wasn't his to take. Then he reached again. Then it became a habit. And habits are easier to keep than they are to break, especially when no one's looking. But someone was looking. Miriam was always looking. That's the part I come back to most. She didn't confront him publicly. She didn't call me in a panic. She sat down, opened the ledger, and started documenting. She built a record. She created a structure that would outlast her own ability to protect it. And she trusted that the truth, properly preserved, would eventually be enough. She was right, not because the universe arranged itself to reward her patience, but because she did the work. The outcome followed from the effort. That's all it was. I think about the power of attorney Mitchell asked me to sign. I didn't sign it. And at the time, I couldn't have told you exactly why. Something felt wrong, and I listened to that feeling. I spent 68 years learning that the quiet alarm in your chest is usually worth heeding. Not always, but usually. Miriam spent 38 years teaching me that without ever making it a lesson. Preston is a different story. He knew something was off, and he looked away from it. I understand that impulse. It's easier, and it's quieter, and it doesn't cost you anything in the short term. But looking away has its own cost, paid later in the currency of self-respect. I watched him sitting at my kitchen table 3 weeks after the conference room meeting, and I could see that cost on his face. He's working through it. That's the most I can say, and I think it's enough for now. What I want people to take from all of this, if anything, and I'm not sure I'm in the business of lessons at my age, is that integrity is mostly just consistency. It's not a dramatic choice made once at a crucial moment. It's 100 small choices made when no one's watching, in quarterly reconciliations and handwritten letters and document safes bolted to wooden shelves behind a drywall. Miriam was consistent her whole life. That consistency was still protecting me a year after she was gone. I'm trying to be worthy of that. I'm not sure I always am. But I know what it looks like now, and that's more than I had before.